So now we have a panel on women's health, co-moderated by Laura Esserman from UCSF and Michelle Williams from Stanford. And I'll ask Laura to introduce the panelists.
Great. So great to be here with everybody. Our topic today is about enabling evidence generation, innovation, and advocacy in women's health. Michelle and I are co-moderating. We'll introduce ourselves in a moment. We are very lucky to have a great panel today. Dinah Blithe, who's the NIH program chief at the Contraceptive Network at NIH, and Laleh Amiri-Kordestani is joining us online in a moment, who is at the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence and in charge of breast cancer and women's cancers. Hilary Marston is a chief medical officer at the FDA, and Michael Drake, my dear friend and president of the University of California. So I'm Laura Esserman, and I lead the breast cancer program here. I'm a lead in a number of large platform trials and have been very involved in CERSI, as I'm sure all of you know, and I am on the board of an organization that's trying to innovate the delivery and implementation of platform trials, Quantum Leap Healthcare Collaborative. It is very clear to me in the 40 years or more that I've worked in this field that we need a more holistic approach to women's health. There's been a lack of progress in research and contraception and a number of the hormonal medications that we use for women across their lifetime. There are restrictions on reproductive care, lack of research on hormonal management, and lots of misinformation and information about and wide access to compounding hormonal medications without restraint or accountability, just to name a few. So we really want to dig into some of these issues. I'm going to turn it over to my co-moderator.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And good morning, everyone. I'm Michelle Williams, and I'm an immediate past dean of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and as of January 1, a professor at Stanford School of Medicine in the Department of Epidemiology and Population Health. I've spent my entire career as a public health person, and I just want to add a little bit to Laura's opening up of this panel. I've spent my entire career working in women's health. Women's health is having a bit of a moment. People are beginning to understand the cost to all of society in the gaps that we have in women's health research and healthcare. You heard this morning about value. Well, when you think about the value proposition of women's health, World Economic Forum last year shared evidence that the global economy could be increased by $1 trillion if we were to close the gap in care and the gap in delivery and the gap in research. I just want to add, we're in a moment where women's health could and should be a movement. When we think about new legislation that limits reproductive health services for planned and unplanned pregnancies, we see opportunities for gaps to be widening, not narrowing. And so I'm hoping in the conversation that we have here, we can talk a bit about disparities, we can talk about gaps by gender, but also by economic status and race and ethnicity.
Okay, without much ado, we're going to get right into it. So, Dinah, we're going to start with you. As the program chief of the Contraceptive Network, you've been involved in reproductive research and supposedly innovation. You certainly are trying to do a lot of that. Can you tell us a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities in this critical area of research and the struggle to get drugs to market?
So I've been a government employee working in contraceptive development for a very long time, and I've worked in collaboration with the FDA, and I've been on the opposite side of the table when we're doing product development, and I can tell you the latter is very terrifying. One of the problems with contraceptive development is that industry feels that it's a bit radioactive, that there are liability issues associated with a failure and what they could be sued for. So innovation is not really happening in industry, and the government is trying to de-risk that process by doing some of the early development work and getting to a certain level of evidence of safety that will be attractive to a company to come in and help us. We do that recognizing that the field is still fraught with disinformation. And I don't mean mistaken information, I mean deliberate attempts to tell untruthful things about the way contraception works and the problems associated with it, the health risks and so forth. There's also difficulty in certain processes, challenges of dual purpose agents, such as something that would protect against pregnancy as well as HIV acquisition, that two agencies within FDA would be working together, and it becomes really difficult to figure out what the pathway is and so forth. And male contraception is another challenge because there's no product, there are no guidelines to follow. We're in a little bit of a zero information zone.
I'd like you to give us an example of a development challenge that you'd like to see us take on, and in particular one that perhaps exacerbates the disparities in access to good care.
So we developed ulipristal acetate as a molecule for emergency contraception. It's on the market. We also developed it as a treatment for uterine fibroids. And it was highly successful at that. Hundreds of thousands of women, nearly 1 million women were treated because it was approved in Europe in 2012 and in Canada in 2014 or 16, somewhere around then. It was still under review at the FDA when some very rare instances in post-marketing, again, at a time when anybody can be prescribed, you don't control who gets the drug as carefully, but 1 out of 100,000 women developed some liver issues, and about 1 out of 200,000 women developed severe liver injury that required a liver transplant. As a result of this, the drug was pretty much restricted, not entirely taken off the market, but in Europe, but really, really restricted. And in the US, it wasn't approved at all. Now, fibroids is a condition that affects a lot of women, and this product also has potential therapy in breast cancer treatment and in reducing dense breasts, which is a problem. So the question becomes, with the desire for protection, what risk is overlooked or mitigated by how much benefit? How much benefit, what conditions would be beneficial that would allow research to take place? Because right now, any research on this drug is on full clinical hold. That's a challenge that's difficult to overcome.
Diana, I want to expand a bit on some of the very important points that you make, and I'm going to take this across a life course perspective in my next question, because we know that hormonal treatment impacts many aspects of reproductive life, from premenarchal stage all the way to reproductive stage, and then peri and postmenopausal. So my question to you, and also your last point's critically important in weighing and balancing the risk and benefit depending on social, racial risk factors. I'm thinking about the burden of fibroids born
In black women.
in
yeah.
black women, and this sort of false dichotomy of benefit risk, creating a vacuum that adds to the disparities in this particular condition. But I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a bit on how can we develop programs that are more holistic, that take a more multimodal view of the risks and benefits, and also consider the importance of life course in making decisions about hormonal therapies.
So hormonal therapy is, well, first of all, I'm famous for saying not all hormones are alike, and that gets confused on so many levels. But hormones span so many fields, and we tend to be in silos. The male contraceptive development folks don't talk that often with the female contraceptive development folks, and you would think that would be a more inclusive group. but none of us are talking to the immunologist, and very few of us are talking to breast cancer people. And hormones are central in all of these areas. We need to find ways of getting experts together with a mission of how to learn more from each other to develop therapies. And I feel like the progesterone receptor modulators, or anti-progestins as they may be known, can be very therapeutic for dense breasts, fibroids we know, and breast cancer treatment. But unless we're able to communicate, we don't know which hormones are going to be better for breast cancer treatment and prevention, and which hormones are going to be harmful. And we need to have that information. So we need more communication across disciplines.
So yeah, that brings us in. So then how do you bring this up, right? So, before, if it's, do you have to have a drug before the FDA, or can we have meetings ahead of time?
Yeah, so I think this is a great opportunity to bring Laleh into the conversation. And Laleh, let me just put the question to you. You know, what are the opportunities to have these important interactions with FDA and the various divisions that might be involved in decision-making to discuss the complexity rather than oversimplify a review of specific agents within the context of a more holistic view of life course health?
Hey, thank you for the question. So we actually have variety of mechanisms for, interacting with, for example, investigators or sponsors, even without a drug product. For example, investigators can request a pre-IND meeting or interact meeting, and we're happy to have a discussion. For example, discuss a clinical trial, or if they have regulatory questions, we can address that. Also, if they have, for example, different indications in mind, because generally the division of the FDA that gets that meeting is dependent on the indication. For example, here, if it is about reproductive, indication, then it goes to another division. If it is for the treatment or prevention of cancer, breast cancer, for example, it will come to our division. And if this sponsor or the investigator wants to discuss both, they can easily put and request that we want, different also review divisions be at the table. And we have actually been consulted, and we're happy to do that. For example, this meeting can be submitted to us, and then we invite the other relevant division, or they can get the meeting request, and they invite us to also be at the table. In addition, so this is more like a formal meeting. We all also are happy to have informal, obviously, conversations. We always do it either through like just in a scientific meeting, we can see and have that discussions, or even like we are happy to get emails and have conversation. We have our office actually routinely has listening sessions, especially with patient advocates or different actually even scientists. If they want to actually voice any things, they can officially submit those, or we can have informal discussion with them. So there are a variety of mechanisms.
Yeah, I think that's super important for people to know. I think most people don't realize that this exists. And so I think that really hinders progress. And that's, I think, particularly important in thinking, about where we go next in women's health. As we discussed on our call, the burden of trying to study primary prevention is really high and very difficult. And so just in thinking about this, perhaps it's really time to rethink the way we approach things like breast cancer prevention by really thinking about making it, say, a secondary effort, say, on a trial like for fibroids. For all we know, there's great evidence that it works for fibroids, and there's great evidence on the antiprogestins that it works to reduce breast cancer risk. Maybe that would help us with the huge excess in mortality in breast cancer. So what is it that we need to be thinking about for secondary endpoints, and how do we start to honestly build those into the trials? And we'll get later to the effort of like, how do we encourage companies to invest in secondary endpoints? But how would you advise the community to start thinking about secondary endpoints like breast density, or background enhancement on an MRI or whatever, that could give us some early endpoints?
So thank you for the question. I think one thing that I want to comment on is that, for example, if a drug goes on full clinical hold and it's still investigators want to study it for a different population, for a different reason, they can submit a new IND in a different division, because, the level of the safety or toxicity tolerance depends on the population. For a more like healthier population that, for example, they only have, fibroids, it may be different versus a patient that has, for example, metastatic disease. So the level of safety or clinical data, or essentially sometimes like we actually can approve a drug with significant liver toxicities or like significant lung toxicities, cardiac toxicities, or variety of toxicities for treatment of breast cancer or other cancers, because the patients are essentially in a scenario that they're going to die quickly from their cancer. So the very rare toxicity that may happen, it's a different risk benefit sort of like a scale. So just having the drug on full clinical hold in a different office doesn't mean that that drug cannot be investigated for different indications. And then going back to your question about secondary prevention, ultimately to get a claim or indication for reducing, cancer, it has to show that the incidence of that type of cancer is reduced. But in the interim, I think we have seen some drugs being studied to, for example, reduce the density, for example, of the breast in, for example, imaging, or other, biomarkers that can be in a short term, assessed. It's the problem is that ultimately all of these short term endpoints need to be shown that they are correlating with what is actually at the end needed to get an approval. And that's why while having these secondary endpoints is important and very actually, I think, good to be thought and planned, at the end, probably a larger study is still needed to get an indication for example, for secondary prevention of cancer or other claims. But we're happy to actually, for example, if a trial is run in a different division for a different indication, they actually ask us to comment on acceptability of their secondary endpoints to look at the variety of things for cancer, and they can just consult us, and we're happy to be at the table and give advice.
Thank you. I want to elaborate a little bit more on the choice of endpoints, and I want to do it within the context of the GLP-1 drugs, which we know are now being taken for a number of major problems. So in a very brief response, if you could, I wondered, can you enlighten us on the way we should be thinking about endpoints? Should we be incorporating early endpoints to determine the impact on, let's say, cancer risk? And also consider endpoints that would help us understand population health level outcomes and impacts. Just if you could keep that brief, if you could.
I guess it depends on what's the ultimately intent of that trial, because one can pick early endpoints, but then if that's more like you will learn about it. But if the intent is at the end actually to get approval for that drug, for that, for example, secondary prevention, then it has to be essentially done in a larger kind of trial. And then that correlation of that early endpoint to that what is needed for approval of that indication needs to be shown.
Yeah.
Great, thank
And
you.
and I think, I think it's I think the challenge to us in the community and the investigators who are building drugs, say, for example, if you're trying to get less toxic, we think more equivalent drugs on the market. This is a big issue for women. There are millions of survivors who take aromatase inhibitors that really have a lot of toxicity, and a lot of people stop taking their drugs. What do we need to do? We need to be thinking about things like neoadjuvant strategies to try and show benefit and develop these markers. It's really hard work, but I think it's clear that if we want to get better pathways forward or faster pathways forward, there's a lot of work to do in that regard.
Absolutely. So this provides a perfect segue, Hilary, to you. And what I wanted to do is open up the conversation with you to ask you, what is the role of the FDA in addressing areas in women's health where there is confusion or misinformation or just lack of information on services where we spend billions of dollars?
Yeah, I love this question and generally look at it as a question across the board with our missions. So the FDA sees itself as a scientific agency, a regulatory agency, and a public health agency. Those missions, when they align, we are at our most effective. When they are slightly in tension, then we can have some difficulties. One area where they are nicely aligned is when we're trying to put out information about the initial approval of a drug, right? So we can put out very templated information. People know where to find it. We can put out, we can have an advisory committee in advance to air some of the information. In that case, the information probably could get out in a fancier way, but we are able to use all of our tools to get that out. In the post-approval setting, when there are additional questions that come up in terms of clinical practice, which is a lot of what you're talking about, that's an area where we end up having a little bit of tension between our missions, right? So we have what we have in the label. We have what is happening in practice, and ultimately we don't regulate the practice of medicine. Your state boards regulate that. So the implementation often goes beyond what we see in the label, whether it's strict off-label use or whether it's just slightly straying a little bit away. And that's where you can end up with questions that come up from the clinical community. And there are a lot of questions that come up. We have an ability to play a role in those sorts of communications and clarifying those issues, in helping to advise on studies that might help actually understand those issues better. But ultimately, in terms of the sorts of quality communications that you would want to see to separate myth from fact, et cetera, the FDA has to work in partnership, right? Because a lot of this goes beyond our strict mission, and federal agencies don't always love to go beyond their strict mission, but we can do it in partnership. So organizations like the CERSIs, organizations like the clinical societies, these are critical partners of ours in getting quality information out. And then organizations like general academia are great partners in answering some of those questions and bringing more clarity to these issues.
Yeah, it's interesting, the bioidenticals, which are not regulated, much like the dietary supplements, I think, Janet, you told me that has to be fixed in Congress? We'll continue to work on that. That's challenging. Okay. All right, I want to bring up something that is, I think, across the missions of the FDA. And so, and near and dear to my heart is the issue of breast cancer screening. It is an enormously expensive undertaking, and the FDA is now mandating reporting of density. And, I see things running through Congress about mandating then the payment for MRIs or ultrasounds. This will increase, over 50% of people have dense breasts. This will require probably an investment of billions of dollars. Now, MQSA, which is under the purview of FDA, just tells us if someone gets a mammogram or not. given this huge need, how can MQSA be now turned into an information gathering? I mean, for something that costs billions of dollars, why, again, we don't have any information. We don't know what's happening.
Yeah. So for folks who don't know this alphabet soup, the Mammography Quality Standards Act was passed in 1992, and it gives FDA the authority to both certify mammography centers and say these guys are providing a product that meets our standards, but also we set standards for the type of reporting and the structure of the reporting that needs to go to patients and to doctors about mammograms. So this is one of these areas where the FDA regulates a lot of things, and even if you've been at the agency for decades, unlike me, I've been at the agency for coming on 3 years, you will find additional things that we regulate. So this is, Jen and I were talking about dishwashers, I think, also one of the products that we regulate. Anyway, so the Mammography Quality Standards Act, we've put out standards now just a couple of times since that passage in 1992. So this is just a demonstration of rulemaking in the federal government takes time. We put out a major update to the mammography, to the MQSA standards in the last year, which was to require that all states, all facilities report on breast density to patients and to doctors. And we did that and set categories for breast density. So when you go from one center to another, your report will mean the same thing. Many states were already requiring this. It is now required nationwide. One of the reasons why this is so important is because breast density is an independent predictor of breast cancer, of risk of breast cancer. So women need this information, but then the question becomes, what do you do with that information? What do you do for your follow-up screening if you're told that you have extremely dense breasts, for example? And the answer is we, as a medical community, beyond the regulatory, we don't know, right? We could answer these questions. We certainly could answer these questions as a research community, but we're going to have to commit to doing that. Could it be done via MQSA, adding additional requirements for reporting? I think that would be a far more difficult path, given what I said about rulemaking, than having some pull come from the clinical community to ask for this sort of information, right? We're sending these patients to you in your clinic to ask you, what do I do with this, right? So you should be asking for the research community to get you some good answers on that. And the easiest way to get those answers well is to make sure that some of those very important pieces of information in the electronic health record are either structured or extractable in a straightforward way.
Maybe that's a role for USCDI Plus, or this is like the idea of having a set of standards. I think, as has been said earlier by all the commissioners, the lack of data and the lack of collection of data in a standard way really makes it almost impossible for us to do our work and give good recommendations, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the Office of the National Coordinator, and they've just changed to an Assistant Secretary, I believe. They are responsible for setting the core data standards for electronic health records, USCDI. There is a kind of food fight when these USCDI standards are updated, because everyone wants to get their little piece into all electronic health records. So it is incredibly difficult to get a full set of information into USCDI. However, they can do these optional packages, USCDI Plus, where they can work with researchers to figure out the types of information that would be helpful to answer these questions. In order for that to be useful, though, somebody needs to buy that package for the electronic health record. And that's, again, where the demand from the clinical community needs to come from.
Okay, well, I think that's a perfect segue to you, to Michael Drake. So, Michael, before you began your stint as chancellors and university president at the Ohio State and now University of California, you actually were in charge of health affairs for the University of California. Again, we have many large medical centers. What is the role? I mean, where's the university in sort of leading the effort to change the way we collect data in healthcare so that we can make better decisions or can integrate care and research so that we can make progress on all of these difficult issues, especially those that are common?
Well, great. Good to see everybody here today. I'm just, as I'm thinking about the world we're living in and things we're talking about, I also want to make sure that we take a moment to realize the real tragedy that's happening in Southern California as we speak. I think that as Californians, we are most likely connected to someone, family or friends or whatever, who's had their lives changed entirely by forces that overwhelmed them. So I want to mention that. Also, I want to mention that just overnight, we followed this. One of the evacuation zones came to within yards of the northwest corner of one of our campuses, UCLA. But I would say that there's great progress made overnight, at least, in retarding the spread toward the east that we were so afraid of. And I'm just thinking about the truly heroic efforts of people who've come and are literally risking their lives to try to save the property and futures of all of us. And so it's important for us, I think, all to focus on those things and the people within us that are working to help make our country and our world a better place. I want to say that as a note of optimism in the world of challenges that we face. That's, if I may. And second, I would say that I think that the kind of primary product of universities, I believe, is knowledge. Our job is to create knowledge through our research and then transmit that knowledge through our teaching and stimulate knowledge through our teaching. And at the basis of that, I believe, is that the knowledge, the things that we create and share as facts that have to be true. And so the truth is really, really key to who we are and what we do, what we bring to society. So I think it's really our responsibility to really continually focus on doing our best to understand and know the truth, and then to make that truth shareable and knowable to other people so they can then build their decisions and behaviors on that truth.
Truth. That's really powerful, and it came up in the debate when we were talking about transparency. Drew Faust, the former president of Harvard, would say whenever she heard faculty asking about transparency, what she was really hearing was, how do I trust the administration? So truth is really important. I wanted to come back to this point, though, because we are in a time where we're seeing neutrality rules surface across universities. And so I'd ask you, as a president of the University of California, to tell us what's the role of a university in this zeitgeist for ensuring that our faculty can continue to speak the truth when it really matters, especially as we're talking about women's health and health equity.
Yes, and thinking about women's health and health equity as a specific focus within this broader lens of the truth and fact. Maybe I'll take 2 minutes to do a 10-minute experiment. So I'll do it sort of virtually rather than really, and then you can all be a part of it. And there's also a test involved, so you'll like that. You're all people who like, everybody here liked taking tests. So here's the test we're going to take. The test is, you're going to, I'm not going to do this, but you're going to pretend that I do it. That's the virtual part of it. So let's, on the screen, instead of our colleague, let's pretend that we have a collage. And the collage is made up of 80, I'm going to say, images of things, random things. The Golden Gate Bridge, a turkey, a sheep, a red wagon, a pickup truck, a whole series of things that are sort of randomly there. And I'm going to ask you each to take a piece of paper and write down the things that you, look at the screen and write down the things that you see. Now, let me say, I'm going to start with the screen being blank, and then I'm going to show the images that are up there, this collage, and then I'm going to take it down. I'm going to show it for 2 seconds. So 1001, 1002, it's down. And then your job is to write down the things that you saw on the screen. I've done this. And what would happen is that if in doing this, what each of us would see is something like 6 or 7 things that we could identify. So you write those things down. And I go to the first person, I'd say, what did you see? And you say, well, gosh, I saw the cat in a hat and a stoplight and a bicycle and a tomato, and oh, great. And then I go to the next person, and you'd say, I saw the cat in a hat, but actually I saw a gorilla, I saw a swimming pool, and we go around, and what we'd find is that some people, several things were seen by most people, Some things were seen by only one person. Sometimes the person sitting next to you saw almost exactly the same things. Sometimes that list was entirely different. If we asked at the end of the day whose list was correct, who got it right? Well, actually, everybody got it exactly right. Everybody had the same experience, but many of us, most of us, took away something slightly different from that experience. Verifiable, true, same place, same time, look at the same thing. I wrote down what I saw. I'm exactly right, but my goodness, it's a little bit different than what you saw. So one is that our perspective makes where we're standing, where we're sitting, what we're seeing is different depending on our perspective. That's the one lesson from that. The other thing is that if we went through the entire audience, we'd see pretty much everything on the board. No one person could see everything on the board, no small group of us, but all of us together could see an awful lot more than any one of us could see together. And by sharing that information, we know more than we did at the beginning. So that's the experiment that we did, and it's, I think, a good lesson. Guidelines toward neutrality, I think, are important. I believe it can be overstated. There are times when it's perfectly fine to be neutral or balanced in the middle. That's great. But there are many times when that's not okay. You're walking by a swimming pool and a child falls in. You don't say, I'm going to have a neutral opinion and keep on walking by, or I'm not going to pay attention. The times when you need to say something or do something when you see something happening. So I think that that's extremely important, and that we have to know when we're doing that. But we have to also understand that there are different perspectives. And so when we're choosing what's true and what's neutral for us, we have to understand that that's in a world in which there are different perspectives.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's super helpful. But, and so in thinking about.
I like the super helpful, but that was a great comment, Laura.
Well, I do think, I think that there have been a lot, some of these issues are very challenging, but I think in particular in women's health, sort of the lack of access to reproductive care for planned or unplanned pregnancies threatens lives. And I think a lot of faculty feel like they need to continue to stand up, collect information, and speak out about it. And I think that it is important, as you said, as a perspective to make sure, that's just one of the many issues. There's so many of these issues that we think lead to disparities. And I presume that one of the things you're trying to say is that it's important for the universities to continue to share this kind of information.
I think the information is critical. Maybe I can say that. I think information, knowledge, data, and facts are critical to us moving forward. And I think we have a responsibility to speak up and to share our opinions and our knowledge on things that are important. We see in the world disinformation and misinformation woven together in ways that inform people improperly or poorly on how they might behave. We saw this astonishingly, inexplicably, but unimaginably, but truthfully. We saw it during the COVID pandemic. People have bad information shared with them or pushed on them. We saw them follow that information, and we watched them die. And it's unbelievable, but we watched it happen in real time. And so we think I think it's critical for us to put up, to be able to create that truth to the best of our ability, and then to share it and stand by it. And so I think faculty and others have a responsibility to do that. And I'll say this, we believe very much in free speech. There are, our country was sort of founded on, the country I grew up learning to love was founded on the inalienable rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, great, and then a constitution that guarantees the freedom of speech. So that's really, really important. We have Title VI, that's an important part of our Civil Rights Act, but actually there's the sort of inalienable right that starts, and then on top of that you build the Constitution, and then the laws derive on or on top of the Constitution. There's a kind of a sequence of those things. And I think that it's very, very important for us to preserve the right of people to speak freely on topics broadly, to be able to continue with this experiment in democracy that we've all cherished so much for so many years.
Well said. Terrific. There are a few people we'd like to call upon in the audience, maybe to start to expand on this conversation. I wanted to call on a representative of pharma. If Ada Habtezian is in the audience, she's the Chief Medical Officer at Pfizer. Ada, are you here? There, you're there. Yeah. I wanted to ask, we know that there are real tremendous challenges to invest in products with secondary endpoints and risk reduction, and that it's a challenge for all of pharma, and yet this is really important for the health of women and men, right? So how do you think we can work together to solve some of these issues? What's sort of your advice? You've been a faculty member at Stanford now, and you, I think, still have that position, and now you're in pharma. What advice do you have for us?
Thank you for that question, and I don't know necessarily that I have, of course, the solution, and that's why I think as I reflect on the panel, so many things come to mind, particularly actually Dr. Drake, as you mentioned, is that bringing different perspectives, and it was also mentioned in terms of partnership, because when there are challenges, I think in my journey, as you mentioned, whether it's in academia or in pharma, when there are these types, multi-pronged challenges, how do we bring people to the table? Like, how do we bring those different perspectives but work in a common goal with a common outcome? Because at the end of the day, it's the patient outcomes, right? That's what we want to see. So as I was reflecting on these discussions, and I was thinking, could there be an example of something that is working? Because sometimes you also have to look at something that is working. Maybe we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So one of the things that I was thinking about is, for example, the AMP. So Dr. Francis Collin, during his tenure, during the NIH leadership, this is an ongoing, I think it's in its 10th year, which is the Accelerating Medicines Partnership. And that brings actually public-private partnership, meaning that the NIH is started, of course, this. It's managed by the foundation, but the NIH Foundation, FDA is part of that. And then you have multiple pharma working to specific projects, specific disease pathways, whether it's finding, targets and things like that, that becomes available to everyone. Everyone can work then together. And there is also academia is part of the nonprofit, and there are nonprofits. So I was thinking about how to take that into more clinical, although this was more about finding disease biology, target, and so on. It's making a lot of stride. Of course, until we see its clinical impact it might take some time. But so I was thinking maybe something like that might be something that we could.
It's an excellent idea. That would include the FDA as well, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
FDA
so
is part of that.
That's another way of sort of convening people ahead of time and allowing everyone to, talk about it.
I'll just make a comment that I've been in this for a while, and when in the late 90s, it felt as if at least my division of NIH and FDA were working more closely. There seemed to be more collaboration, more communication. I feel as if that's decreased a lot, and now it doesn't seem to happen much at all. And the opportunities are great because FDA knows more stuff than anybody else because you have access to more secret information, if you will. So you know some of the questions that the general researchers don't know. Is there a way to, you don't have enough of a research budget to address these questions, but can you work more closely with NIH to try to, spur some more communication and collaboration?
Yeah, well, I think that could be a mandate. I'll put that on the list of our mandate for next year. So hopefully we'll make some progress on that over the next year.
Keep watching this space. I want to reach out to Sarah Horton. Sarah, I can't, there you are. So Sarah is the Executive Director of Access and Diversity at Quantum Leap Healthcare Collaborative. And Sarah, you heard Diana talk about, recount the issue of how antiprogestins are now blocked from use to treat conditions that are particularly problematic for Black women, uterine fibroids, because of their very, very rare association with liver failure.
It may not even be an association.
And it may not
yeah.
be, right? It's a signal that we still have to prosecute with research. But my question to you is, what's a reasonable trade-off when we're thinking in the context of this example? What's a reasonable trade-off? And then how do we get to a place where we're filling the knowledge gap with research that results in actionable decision-ready results? And then I wanted to anticipate that you're going to say more research. Well, if we do head towards that space, will women actually enroll in trials that would address a question like the antiprogestins risk-benefit?
Thank you. Thank you for having this panel and asking that question. So as a medical oncologist, I weigh benefits and risks all the time. And so when I think about this question, especially in the realm of the progestins and in women with fibroids, I think about what you said, that we know that this is a disease that disproportionately affects Black women. As an oncologist, even though my focus was breast cancer, you hear about these things. And I think we all anecdotally, especially for Black women, have heard about the impact it has on women in society, the way it affects being able to work, anemia, surgery, which is commonly used for this, and infertility. So it's a very important issue within the community. We know that from the studies that this drug, the progestins, can help with decreasing the impact of the size of the fibroids and the impact it has on life. So I think looking at that, and especially being very critically rigorous about looking at the liver toxicities that were seen in these women. And again, I think it was all post-marketing events and it was very, very rare.
Yeah.
Right, and it stopped the forward movement of this drug, which could be very helpful in the community. I think knowing these things, I think it would be reasonable to look at readdressing clinical studies with a very focused eye on strict criteria on evaluating liver toxicities, looking at your inclusion criteria of the women involved, even looking back on the studies that were already done that may not have shown this adverse event, just to kind of hone in and identify, how we could go forward smartly. And if we're able to start these trials again, then being really focused on a plan to intervene quickly and address this so that it doesn't move on to the point of these 2 in 100,000 women who did have severe liver toxicity. In addressing your question, how do you talk to women and do you think that they would participate? I definitely think that they would with education. I think patient education across the board in clinical trials is really important, and involving advocacy groups and the community outreach groups that patients trust in talking about this, even before you reinstitute a study, familiarizing the advocacy groups about what we're talking about today, how rare it is, the occurrence, how well it worked in the past. And starting from that framework, I think it could be successful. I think it's important to think about, because if this is something that could be used in the community, I think it could really impact a lot of women in a positive way.
Yeah, that's great. Critical
Thank you,
points.
Sarah.
Okay.
All right, one other person. Is Andrea Olario in the audience? Yeah. So while you're coming to the mic, I know that your organization, Medicines, she's the CEO of Medicines 360, has been very involved in trying to provide access to medicines. And there's a lot of, products in the women's health space that have to be cheap and accessible. Not necessarily something that's aligned with incentives for pharma companies. So, especially now we're talking about trying to continue development and then add secondary endpoints. How do we encourage manufacturers to work on this? Or is this something, is this something where we need a big investment from philanthropy or the NIH? Or what do you see as a potential solution?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and this is very important, because we are talking about two things. One is developing new products, and then making those products available to all women, and especially including the underserved ones. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes decades for a new innovation, which is very expensive, to get to everybody. So when we are looking at this question, we are having two parts. One is development of a drug, testing of a drug, getting it through FDA approval, and we all know that costs a lot of money. And then on the other hand, you have to have an access strategy, because it's not okay to just make it available to women like us who have a really good PPO and can go anywhere, UCSF-Stanford, not. So when you put these two together, then really what we are seeing is need of investment. And unfortunately, women's health has had less investment than other pharma or medical devices. That is changing, but still, let's recognize when we are going to 2% to 4% compared to others, that yes, it's doubling, but it's doubling that tiny bit, not? So it's very important to consider investment, de-risking. And when you look at manufacturers, not we are a odd manufacturer because we are a medical research organization, non-profit. We develop products and we partner them to get them to the market. But it's mainly a profit-driven world, not? And you still need to create the incentives that this world develops new products and makes them accessible. So in my opinion, the solution is a broader coalition where you have everybody involved and not just the manufacturers, put everything on the manufacturers, not? So you can have academia, because science comes from academia, but it needs to be translated sometimes quicker to industry. Sometimes it takes a long time, that knowledge to translate to industry. Not, then we have FDA, we talked a lot, I will not get into it. There might be optimization in FDA to get things with surrogate endpoints, with real life data. We heard about AI, a lot of things, not? Then we have industry, not? A lot of the new ideas are actually coming from mid-size and small companies. So how can we incentivize them? Government, other parts like reimbursement, extremely important because price, cost, it's not a universal answer. We provided our drug for a very low price, and it was not such a big uptake because the system is so complex that sometimes it does not incentivize to buy the cheaper drug. So it's very complex, not? And then we have investment, not? We have to convince investors, especially impact investors, to really come up and invest. And then philanthropy, I absolutely think philanthropy has a place and can act as a catalyst. It's like the ignition key to really start everything, especially, Laura, if we are talking about prevention, because getting the clinical data to back prevention, it's a long road and it's costly. So you have to, philanthropy, I think it's perfect to be the one who starts this, catalyzes this, and then all the other stakeholders come together.
Okay, any other comments from the panel before we go to our lightning round? Any burning comments that people want to make? Okay, Michelle.
All right, so lightning round and for our panel. And what I'd like to ask all panel members is to limit the response time to 20 seconds. And Mark's counting. All right, so the question is, do we need another women's health initiative? And I'll start with you, President Drake.
Yes.
All right. All right, Hilary, you've got your 20 seconds and 19 more.
We kind of have one, but it's very, very broad. So yes, plus.
All right. Diana?
Well, I would say it has to be very different from the previous one, because the previous one had a lot of flaws.
Yeah, yeah. Laleh?
Laleh?
I say yes. Generally in trials, we only have limited sample size of patients, so studying great questions in a very large population is going to be helpful, and essentially that helps with asking multiple questions. So it's definitely a yes.
And what
I'm
about
going to
you?
say yes, exponent n. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. And now that we still have extra time, thank you, Michael, for setting the trend. So who should be at the table? Is this like so who should be at the table? That's our last lightning piece.
So I think that, again, from my point earlier, I think the table needs to be inclusive. I think it's important to have different perspectives. I was just thinking Hilary and I, with my prior example, could be sitting in the same place at the same time, looking at the same thing and taking different things away from it. And as we're looking forward to an initiative that would really help us to address the problems that we face broadly, I believe in being inclusive with broad perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. Patient community would be a broad swath of the U.S. population, so figuring out how to get that representation is tricky. But I also think for the clinical community, again, you need that pull. This will probably come from primary care docs, so I'd love to see them involved.
Yeah, and the FDA and the NIH, right? Right?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Well, I think if you provide a lot of funding, you will get a lot of response. Now, the question is, where is the response coming from? And you need to have the community engaged to figure out what the questions you need to answer are. And that's where I think
Maybe that's a great role for philanthropy,
Yeah.
is to help sponsor the discussions and the questions and getting the strategy.
Because we're all, as I said earlier, we're all in our silos, and we need to be able to, I love your example, because I feel like if we can find out what our brains are seeing only 6 things and somebody else is seeing 5 other things, we can have a better communication across why we didn't see that and how what they saw applies to what we were thinking. Yeah.
Laleh, who needs to be at the table?
I agree with what was said. In addition to, I guess the funding of such large a study essentially can only come from government, but definitely involving the primary care physicians who are going to be involved as investigators, as well as if it is going to be on women, having many women actually providing input, because a lot of also these additional questions adds burden. So we have to be realistic, asking really important questions.
Yeah, I'm going to say yes to all of the responses, and I'm going to say add influencers. Many of our major institutions have lost trust, but we also don't have a direct line of communication. So I'm going to say engage the influencers who reach people, and we shouldn't make light of them.
I agree with that. And I think I would also add to everyone also the people working on the biomarker people community and people working on secondary endpoints in the oncology community, right? That part of what we want to do is have hormonal treatments across a woman's lifetime that also work on cancer prevention, that work for cancer prevention. So, all right, just to summarize, our to-do list for next year, I'm sure we can do it in a year, is, to take this forward, fight misinformation with data and data collection through the universities, the academic community, but also maybe through mechanisms through the FDA. I'm not going to give up on that quite yet, and the NIH. Definitely get philanthropy to help us catalyze a conversation about how to generate a new women's health initiative, work with the community to build secondary endpoints for prevention and toxicity measurements that the FDA can trust, that people can trust, build coalitions to support and overcome all these financial barriers, and lastly, make sure our experts are empowered and not silenced. Have I missed any?
No, I think this is great. I think it's a long list, and we have a lot of work to do in 364 days.
Well, all right. And then for those of you particularly interested in this, we have started an annual meeting called Rise Up for Breast Cancer to really address some of these. And I met Diana, and preparing for that gave me lots of good ideas. So we are now only standing between you and lunch. Lunch is in the Robertson, downstairs in the atrium, the Fisher surrounding area, and you can meander around the posters and whet your appetite for the poster session later this afternoon. A big round of applause again for our fabulous panel, and thank you, Laleh.